Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Krasnohorivka, the town that located to the west of Donetsk, the town that the Russians were storming with, let's say if you remember, Turtle Tank, the town that is the last defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine on this direction of 2014, let's say the defense belt that had the Ukrainians start creation a very long time ago. And today we got one of the most important updates from the direction. The Russians, as a result of very heavy clashes, fierce battles, managed to establish complete control over the industrial zone, more precisely over the Krasnohorivka Ocheretyne plant. So the Russians raised the flag, but as you can see, the Russians are still very, let's say, try to be very careful because there are still Ukrainians around, but not, let's say, in a few hundred meters, but obviously very far from this area, which confirms that the Russians are moving further and that most likely the Ukrainians will be forced to fall back from the town within the next few days, not even weeks, because the Russians control the strategical hill. Currently, the Ukrainians who are located in the eastern part of Krasnohorivka, we're talking about high-rise building, let's say, has a very big risk of being encircled by the Russians. So that's why we can expect this night the beginning of the withdrawing process, because now the Russians don't have any barriers in front of them. They control the industrial zone, the biggest buildings. Now they can see everything that located to the north, and of course they will continue movements. So we can say that on the 4th of May, Krasnohorivka has fallen. Of course, the Russians control just, let's say, 45% of the stronghold of the town, by the Russians controls the most important 45%, and the Ukrainians control, let's say, when talking about the importance of the area, the Russians control 95% of important territories of Krasnohorivka, and the Ukrainians control just 5. Now, if the Russians continue moving further to the north, they have chances to encircle the Ukrainians who are currently located in the eastern Krasnohorivka, if they haven't already started their abandoning process. Now we're moving further to Ocheretyne direction, where we also got significant number of updates and details. As you can see, we have adjusted the map, because today we got the final confirmation of full Russian control over Ocheretyne, over Arkhanhelske, Keramik, and Novokalinovo. Yet we still haven't received any updates whether the Russians control the fields, but according to the previous updates, the Russians have bypassed this territory and even moved further to the northwest. So let's discuss everything in details. The first update we received today took place in the morning, and we have already discussed the video. On this video, for example, we can see how the Ukrainians were abandoning their positions from the north in Arkhanhelske to the north, further to the village by the name of Kalinovo. As you can see, a few important things I would like to point your attention. First of all, the Ukrainians were moving with significant number of infantry at the same time. This is the first thing. The second thing, the Ukrainians were abandoning their positions during the daylight, not during the night period of time, just during the daylight. So the Ukrainians were risking very much, because obviously when talking about the situation, we understand that Ukrainians had no chances to evacuate, to abandon their positions in Arkhangelsk towards Kalinovo without casualties and losses. We will not watch the video till the end, because in the, let's say, final seconds of the video, the Russians start bombing that convoy, and the Ukrainians most likely had significant losses. Maybe the entire group was destroyed. So if we return back on the map, the Ukrainians started their movements in the vicinity of this building. So the first seconds took place exactly in the area. We see significant number of Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians were moving further to the north along these, let's say, fields, these roads. And when the Ukrainians reached this point, the Russians started bombing them heavily with artillery. Most likely, most of those Ukrainians left on the battlefield. Later, we continue receiving updates from different Russian sources, but mainly those were the reports, let's say, telegram messages, rumors, and talks without video confirmations. And according to information from those three sources, the Russians managed to, or started the clashes for this stronghold. So the Russians were saying that they entered the fortifications and trenches, and the clashes were taking place, heavy clashes were taking place in the area. And the second report in the morning was that the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and basically to enter Nevelske from the southeast. And according to the Russians, they managed to enter the area and establish control over the first buildings, streets, and so on. So very important update, very important progress that we will discuss just in 5 minutes. Later we continue receiving reports and updates about Arkhanhelske, but later we start receiving the video updates. And the most important video update is this one. And the Russian sources, somewhere at noon, let's say somewhere at 4 p.m. of the local time, published the video of the flag raised that was raised in the northern part of the village by the name of Arkhanhelske, which confirms complete 100% control over the territory. And after that, of course, we have adjusted the map and colored the entire Arkhanhelske as a territory under Russian control, but there were some doubts and questions about the positions in Keramik and the fields. And almost the same time, more precisely even before, somewhere at 2 p.m. of the local time, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were bombing the Russian forces along the tree lines. So would like to point your attention to this tree line. You see that two tree lines, intersection of two tree lines, and if we return back on map, we can see these let's say tree lines on the screen. So the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions in this area, and the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions in this area, which also confirms that both, let's say, parts of this tree line were under complete Russian control. And based on those three geolocations, let's say even four, the Ukrainian abandoning positions, the Russian flag in the northern part, and the Ukrainian bombing the tree lines, we considered and made a conclusion that the entire area between to the south of these, let's say, geolocations is under complete Russian control. So that's why we adjusted the map. And now the most important question, what the Russians are planning to do next. And now it's important to understand, and let's say finally to get the answer, whether the Russians managed to enter Nevelske or not. The thing is that unlikely the Russians are planning to move further to the north in direction of Kalinovo through these fields. Maybe the Russians will do this. Everything depends on the Ukrainian, let's say, possibilities, capabilities, their spirit, their common situation in their army, and so on. Why the Russians will not, according to my understanding, move in this direction? And the thing is the water barriers. If we take a look at the area, we see one water barrier in Kalinovo that goes to the south, and the second, let's say, water barrier, the same story, goes to the south, which is very difficult to attack in this area because this let's say Russian attack can appear as an ambush and artillery pocket with significant losses. So that's why for the Russians it is much more better to attack Kalinovo from the east, from the south, from the southwest using this road. But if the Russians are planning to attack Kalinovo using this road, of course there are very big risks of being counterattacked by the Ukrainians from the village by the name of Zelene Polye. So this is exactly what the Ukrainians are going to do, and this is exactly what the Ukrainians understand the Russians are going to do. So if the Ukrainians counterattack the Russians can have significant losses because the distance of the fields is very big. To bypass, let's say, 5, almost 4 kilometers under the open air is very difficult during the special military operation. You can be attacked by FPV drones, by artillery, many other different things. So that's why it's the vital question for the Russians, first of all, to establish control, or at least to create a strong, let's say, foothold in Nevelske, which will allow them to secure, at least more or less secure, the movements from, let's say, the south to Kalinovo. Furthermore, the Russians started already bombing the village by the name of Tarasovka and Zelene Polye. Today we got at least two different statements from different resources that the Russians start bombing Tarasovka heavily with aviation bombs, with rockets. So most likely the Russians were bombing the concentration of Ukrainian forces. And we have the first photos and videos of results of those attacks, the destroyed buildings, temporary positions of the Ukrainians. The question is why the Russians are bombing these territories. The thing is, as we already discussed, these are two villages that Ukrainians are planning to use as a small, let's say, logistic hub for counterattack the Russian offensives. Because as you can see, there are just fields and no places where you can hide vehicles or concentrate forces. The closest, the nearest towns that Ukrainians have in the area is Zelene Polye and Tarasovka. So that's where the Ukrainians have already started the concentration of forces. And as soon as the Russians begin the attack towards Kalinovo, the Ukrainians will try to attack them in their flanks along this road. But most likely these attacks are not going to give Ukrainians the, let's say, results they're expecting, because they will face the same problem. The distance from Zelene Polye towards, let's say, possible Russian roads of attack, this one is around, let's calculate, around 5 kilometers, even more than the Russian one. So if the Russians started movements here, the Ukrainians will be forced to start their movement here, and let's say from the north, and the Russians will be able to get Kalinovo even earlier than the Ukrainians can get the Russian offensive road. So this is the situation, but this is the reality that Ukrainians are facing: complete collapse of their defense belt, and nobody knows how exactly the Ukrainians are planning to stabilize the situation. Now let's move to the west of Avdiivka, of Semyonovka, of Berdych. We have a lot of very interesting updates as well. As you can see, the Russians are not moving in the western direction, and most likely the main reason why the Russians are not moving is the possible, let's say, getting into artillery pockets. This is the first artillery pocket that the Ukrainians try to force the Russians to enter, and this is the second artillery pocket that also the Ukrainians are trying to force the Russians to enter. So these two artillery pockets are located between the rivers and water barriers. So the same story as to Kalinovo. So this is the reason why the Russians are not going to move there, as well as here and here. And the Ukrainians try to force the Russians to do this, and for these purposes the Ukrainians sometimes move on the line of combat contact the armored vehicles and tanks. For example, we got today a lot of videos how the Russians managed to destroy Ukraine Abrams tanks, so 47th Mechanized Brigade and Bradley as well. The Russians destroyed that tank with Krasnohorivka, let's say rounds, let's say self-propelled, let's say accurate shell, and we have from different angles the same video. That's the first one was the video of strike, and now we have the video of explosions and fire. This first attack, let's say a little bit in the right corner we see destroyed Bradley, then we see the fly of Krasnohorivka. Let's take a look again. This is the Krasnohorivka on the right corner and moves right to the tank, and something was destroyed to the north. So a few, 2 or 3 armored vehicles of armored forces of Ukraine were destroyed during that attack, and we also have the video of flame, of fire on the tank and so on. So not a very beautiful picture before the 9th of May, Victory Day for the Russians when talking about the Western countries. Anyway, the offensive operation in this direction continues. Now let's talk a little bit about Nitailova. After a very long operational pause, today we start receiving the first updates about the situation inside of the village, and according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture a few buildings and additional streets on the way to the central part and to the main road that the Ukrainians are currently using to supply and support their forces in Yasnobrodovka. So the Russians are about to cut the main supply road. Krasnohorivka we have already discussed. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Novomikhailivka, Kostiantynivka, Ugledar direction. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours we received significant number of FPV drone geolocations, and as you might see, the Russians have 3 areas of concentration. The first area of concentration of Russian attacks lays exactly along the Paraskovivka village. We got today significant number of geolocations of how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainian positions on this line. Also we have the video and lots of geolocations from the southeastern part of Kostiantynivka, and we see that the Russians currently are trying to clear the first buildings, the trenches and the fortifications on this way, and we also got significant number of geolocations of how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainians in the fields between Vadyana and Salotka. On this video we can see the Ukraine FPV drone operators that were destroyed as a result of attack. On this video we can see just FPV hunting, and after 4 the Ukrainian soldiers who were moving along the tree lines, some special forces maybe. On this video we can see let's say on this video we can see another trenches in the fortifications that were under very heavy fire. So if we summarize everything, we can make a conclusion that the Russians currently are planning to attack Kostiantynivka on 3 directions. The first one is Salotka and then further to the west in direction TO524 road. The second road of attack, Novomikhailivka to Kostiantynivka to the south of Paraskovivka. So this is going to be the second, let's say roads of attack. And the third, and one of the most important roads of attack, is through Paraskovivka further to the west in direction of this Garden Holders Association Shakhtar. So 3 ways of attacks, and they have this one and the same purpose: to establish physical control over the road 0524 and to cut Ugledar from supply and support. Because if the Russians are able to cut these roads, then Ugledar obviously will fall during probably a few months after. And obviously this is going to be the next let's say, big battle from the Russian side. Now we're moving to Ocheretyne, and the Russian sources continue offensive operation. The Russian forces, if you remember yesterday we were talking that according to different mappers, the Russians have already established complete control over the southern part of Ocheretyne. More precisely, the Russians captured the farms, but we haven't received any geolocations confirming this, and today the Ukrainian sources published the first geolocations confirming that something big took place in this area during the previous few days. We have just a small episode of Russian assault, one tank in the head of the convoy and two personnel carriers with significant number of stormtroopers were heading towards Ukrainian positions in the south of Ocheretyne. Then Ukrainians sent their own tank, and one tank damaged the Russian tank, but even regarding the fact that the Russians lost the tank, they managed to land the infantry, and after the landing the infantry, the personnel carriers returned back to the mainland. So that this is the situation that took place in Ocheretyne. Currently we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to establish complete control or not, but anyway, during the next few days we're going to receive updates about this situation. Now we're moving to Chasiv Yar. We continue receiving updates from this territory as well. Today most of the sources were saying that very heavy clashes are taking place inside of the eastern part of Chasiv Yar, from the south and from the let's say north and south and south eastern parts, and from the eastern parts of the stronghold. Russians were bombing this territory heavily with all types of weapons they have, including total and traverse systems. And today we got very interesting video how the Russians start using not just aviation like Su-25 storm aircrafts, but storm jets, but also the Russians start using helicopters in the battle for Chasiv Yar. And this is very unique and rare footage from the special military operation. Probably for the first time since the beginning of the battle for Chasiv Yar, the Russians start using the helicopters with infantry on board. Maybe that was something like marine operation. Maybe the Russians landed, let's say, soldiers and some special groups behind the Ukrainian main positions, but as I understand, significant number of helicopters were involved in the operation by the name of the battle for Chasiv Yar. We see the helicopters heading towards Chasiv Yar, and then we see the helicopters were launching missiles, and then we can see the explosions that took place along the railways. Very interesting. The Russians haven't been using, let's say, helicopters very close to the line of combat contact probably since the Gostomel operation. Anyway, we see the significant concentration of fire. We see also significant concentration of fire on the southwestern part of the eastern Chasiv Yar. The Russians continue bombing this territory, and most likely this is exactly the area where the Russians are planning or have already entered the stronghold itself. So if you remember, during the previous days we talk a lot that most likely the Russians have already established complete control over this Stupki Golubkovsky and the German forest, and most likely the Russians are planning or were planning to move further to the north to eastern block of Chasiv Yar using this defense belt. And this is the reason why the Russians are so concentrated exactly on this part, because they're trying to clear the passage for further offensive. Furthermore, we got more and more videos confirming that most of the, let's say, roads over Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal were destroyed. On this video, for example, we can see the main supply road that Ukrainians were using to hold their positions, and we see that the Russians not just destroyed, damaged this road, but also they were waiting when the Ukrainians will try to use some track or tank above the road, and they destroyed the Ukrainian armored vehicle exactly when the armored vehicle was on the road. So that's why the road wasn't just destroyed, it was even blocked, also blocked by damaged armored vehicle on it. So this is also a type of blockade that the Russians are trying to establish over the eastern Chasiv Yar. So we need to understand one thing: the Russians most likely are not able to seize control over the entire Chasiv Yar, but most likely the Russians are trying to capture Chasiv Yar before the victory day, before the 9th of May. Anyway, regarding whether the Russians are able to do this or not, we can make a conclusion based on the updates we just discussed that either Krasnohorivka and Arkhanhelske, Novobakhmutovka, Keramika, Ocheretyne, all these towns have already fallen, and as a result of Russian pressure, and most likely by the 9th of May, the Russians would achieve additional progress. and after the 9th of May, the Russians may start the next phase of the special military operation by opening the Kharkiv front line or something like this. When talking about Sivers's direction, we don't have lots of updates, just regular activity. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainians' positions along the railways, and the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions and artillery howitzers to the west of Bilogorovka, trying to suppress the Ukrainian positions, trying to suppress Ukrainian artillery forces and to clear the way for further offensive. Southern Kupiansk direction, we haven't received anything, as well as about central Kupiansk, but when talking about the northern Kupiansk direction, we got significant number of updates. This morning we got somewhere 10 a.m. of the local time, we received the first updates that the Russians seized control over Kotliarivka, or at least entered the village, but later, almost right before I start making the video, somewhere during that afternoon time, the Russians published the video with the Russian flag inside of Kotliarivka, and the Russians were saying that the units of the 47th Tank Division knocked out the Ukrainian armed forces and established complete control over the village. So the Russians have complete control, the Ukrainians were forced to fall back. Currently, we still haven't received any updates from about the western, let's say, Kislovka, this part, but most likely there are very heavy clashes, and this is exactly what I was trying to tell you, that most likely that before the victory day, the 9th of May, the Russians will establish complete control over this territory. And of course, if the Russians are able to seize this territory, control over this territory, then we can be 100% sure that the villages like Ivanovka and Stepova Novoselovka also would be captured by the Russians, because it will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold these territories under Russian pressure. And after that, nobody can tell for sure where exactly the Ukrainians will be able to stop the Russians. Kharkiv directions, we haven't received lots of updates, just some videos of redeployment of additional reinforcements to the border, to the area of the special military operation. We can't tell for sure whether it took place here or somewhere else, but the Russians are sending infantry and soldiers in the area of the special military operation. We got some videos of the results of Russian missile strikes in Kharkiv, so we'll see what is going to be next. Another important things are coming from Kiev, a little bit political events, not from Kiev, more from Russia. We have lots of very interesting details. According to information we have, Russia, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs had put Vladimir Zelensky on the wanted list. So this is very important, and not just him, but also the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, has also been put onto the wanted list, and we got a report that the head of Ukrainian infantry army, not Syrsky, but the man who replaced him, was also put on the same list. So this is something like a warning to Zelensky before the 21st of May, when his present terms will be finished, that you have just few days left, less than 2 weeks, or a little bit like 2 weeks before we will capture you, arrest you, and then we will judge you. Russians will judge you on the things that you've made during the previous few years. So this is like the warning. But from the other side, we continue receiving updates from the United Kingdom. The British Foreign Secretary Cameron arrived in Kiev and began negotiations on a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. But from the other side, the United Kingdom advises its citizens to avoid all travel to Ukraine and within 50 kilometers of the border with Belarus. So this is very important, let's say, announcement, but the same statements the United Kingdom made before the, let's say, February of 2022. But now, as for me, I'm expecting for the same statements from, let's say, Germany and, let's say, the United States. If these two countries also make the same statements, asking their citizens to avoid any travel and abandon territory to Ukraine, these things will means that the Russians are about to start the next greatest offensive on the territory of Ukraine. But for now, neither German nor, let's say, United States embassies made any statements. So for now, we're like keeping everything as is, without any, let's say, movements in this direction. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.